Hello everyone, peace be upon you. Before we begin, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe, and stay with me until the end of the story. Also, leave a comment telling me which city and country you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story has reached. For those of you who have already subscribed, I sincerely wish you good health, ease in all your affairs, abundant blessings, and may all your hopes and dreams come true. Amen. Now, let's begin the story. Madison Halloran grew up where the mountains cut the horizon and the air smelled of pine and cold. She learned to read the sky the way other kids learned the alphabet. Every cloud, every jet contrail was a sentence. In Cedar Ridge, Colorado, planes were both rumor and promise. Her father kept his old uniform rolled in the attic like a secret, and on quiet nights she would take it down and imagine what it felt like to be up there, in a space where everything below looked small enough to forgive mistakes. That image lodged in her like a compass needle and never stopped pointing. By the time she was old enough for the Naval Academy, she traded sketches of airplanes on napkins for flight manuals and late-night study sessions that smelled of coffee and determination. She wasn't loud about it. Maddie didn't need to be. There was an economy to her confidence, quiet, practiced, earned. People noticed the way she moved through rooms, measured, unhurried, like someone who had already decided what mattered. That same calm followed her into Fort McAllister, where the sun hit San Diego differently, flatter and hotter, and everything moves a touch faster because the horizon there is a working thing. On her first day at the base, she felt the old small-town looks, curious, polite, skeptical, slide off her like cheap rain. Colonel Rob Halstead had the kind of presence that narrowed a room. He didn't waste words. He watched the new traffic of pilots with an even brow, a man who'd spent decades measuring people by their actions, not their resumes. Trevor Briggs, the SEAL captain, carried the quiet certainty of someone whose decisions had weight on other people's lives. Marcus Boyd swaggered just enough to make someone like Maddie raise an eyebrow. He was competent, loud in ways that tried to cover the unease of being tested. Denise McKinney moved differently, hands that had known engines and bolt patterns and the way metal complained when it was pushed too far. She had the kind of no-nonsense smile that told you she would forget nothing you asked of her. The USS Franklin Pierce loomed off the coast like a city that had misplaced its map. Flight deck crews moved in choreography that was both dangerous and beautiful. People who worked there spoke in quick bursts and hand signals instead of long conversations because the machines they served would not wait. Maddie watched the deck for a long time before she walked across it for the first time, helmet tucked under her arm, flight suit pressed but not new. She caught the smell of fuel, salt, and something metallic that tasted like focus. Her first flights were tests of patience and nerve. Catapult launches felt like being flung out of a skin you'd learned to trust. Landings took more time, timing, inches, the delicate dishonesty of speed and control. Marcus mocked the steadiness of her hands once, but it was that same steadiness that saved her a dozen small mistakes. Halstead watched from the tower, and when she made the errors that everyone makes early on, he recorded them without flourish and then watched what she did next. At night, when the carrier's lights blurred into a single band of white and the ocean was a dark thought under the deck, Maddie would sit with Denise by a maintenance console. Denise would talk about tolerances and the stories bolts could tell, and Maddie would listen, soaking the practical wisdom like fuel. "You fly calm, Halloran," Denise said once, tapping a tablet screen. "There's a difference between calm and frozen. Keep the first." Maddie nodded. She had already felt the line between them. The rest of her life had been about learning to stand on it without falling. The early days were grinding but honest. Training pushed them hard, simulators that shook the breath out of you, lectures at dawn, runs across the base until your lungs forgot the point of complaining. Maddie learned to answer when the call came and to not let the doubt that sometimes lived in other people's eyes become her own. In the quiet between drills she thought of Cedar Ridge and the way the mountains could look almost casual from a distance, like they were holding back a secret strength. That was the feeling she wanted to carry into the cockpit, not to be flashy, but to be steady when the sky tried to make you frantic. People started to take note not because Maddie shouted or proved anything eagerly, but because she kept showing up, ready, focused, unafraid of the long work. The Navy has its rituals, it has its tests and its quiet approvals. A nod from Halstead. A rare laugh from Briggs. A grudging clap on the shoulder from Marcus after a day when everyone learned a little more about what she could do. Those small things began to form a map. This was where she belonged. And as the Franklin Pierce readied for deployment, and as the schedules filled and the briefings stacked into a rhythm, Maddie felt a kind of responsibility settle around her shoulders, not for the medals, but for the quiet promise she'd made to herself years ago when she first pressed her face to a plane's window and decided she would not stop until she could speak the sky like a language, became the quiet engine behind every choice she made, and it followed her into the briefing room the morning the world leaned toward trouble. The projection screen showed jagged lines and coded boxes, but what everyone heard was a single, clipped line from operations, a downed asset, hostile territory, extraction window measured in minutes. The room thinned around the edges, faces sharpened into duty. Halstead stood at the front, voice low and precise. "We've got one chance to get him out. Conditions are messy. I want options." A dozen pilots shifted, calculators and risk maps already running in their heads. Trevor Briggs outlined enemy posture, terrain, and the fact that the team on the ground was Navy, no margin for error. There was tension, the kind that sits in your throat and makes your coffee taste like metal. Silence stretched until Marcus Boyd smirked, half to hide nerves. "So who's volunteering to fly into the teeth of that?" No hands went up. The room was full of experienced pilots who knew the difference between bravado and responsibility. And then Maddie stood. She didn't fling herself into the air like somebody begging for a trophy. She rose with the same measured ease she used on long flights, and everyone's attention tightened like a bone. "You sure?" Halstead asked, not looking surprised so much as confirming the obvious. Maddie's face didn't change. "Yes, sir. I'll take lead." There was a pause, and Briggs' eyes held something like a re-evaluation. "Permission to brief, sir," she added. When Halstead nodded, she walked to the map and moved her finger over terrain and approached corridors the way she'd studied them at night, the same calm cadence that had gotten her through engine stalls and low-visibility landings. Her plan was surgical: terrain masking, time suppression runs, short window for insertion. It was the kind of plan that required trust, not just from the leader but from everyone who would fly in formation behind her. They launched with a kind of silent choreography. The Franklin Pierce turned into the wind, catapults snatched jets forward, and the deck became a ribbon of flares. Marcus flew tight on her wing, his earlier smirk replaced by an intense focus. Denise's voice over the rigger's channel cut through with one-line updates: fuel checks, ordnance clear, and Maddie answered like a metronome. On the deck, things that had been theoretical became real fast. The sea under them tightened into dark texture, and clouds gathered into a throat. The flight in was brutal. Turbulence punched the air, instruments blinked under strain, and the satellite link that fed the ground picture jittered into static at the worst moments. Maddie's hands moved with an economy that made the cockpit feel like a second skin. She corrected, compensated, and kept the aircraft on the invisible line she'd drawn over the map. Radio bursts from the team were fragmented and urgent. Enemy movement was closer than predicted. At one point, a system warning chimed in her console: hydraulics degraded by a shrapnel hit from an unseen defense battery. For a breath, a small, human thought scraped across her mind: this could be the end of it. Then practice kicked in. She changed configuration, rerouted power, and held the jet steady. The warning light didn't go away, but the plane could still fly. They came in low and fast, the world a montage of shadow and broken trees. Maddie's voice carried the weight of the brief and the lightness of someone who trusts herself. 2 minutes to window. Suppression on my mark. The strike run was precise. Marcus laid down covering fire while Maddie's targeting locked compounds and cleared the corridor. On the ground, Briggs' team sprinted to the pickup point under flare light. For a moment, it seemed they'd pulled it off, the ground team moving toward extraction, the rotor shadows converging. Then a hidden battery opened up, and the sky broke into hell. Missiles screamed in from a ridge. One struck low, cratered the earth, and the shock wave scrubbed the air of sound for a second. Marcus' jet burst into a roll, and Maddie felt the GS press her into the seat. Systems flickered. Her HUD painted threat vectors in angry red. The calm she'd cultivated didn't evaporate, it sharpened. She radioed Briggs with a voice like steel. "Move now. I'm drawing their focus." She dove, sheaved the jet into a canyon, and used the rock faces as a shield. The missile dance around her became choreography, flares, countermeasures, a heartbeat when she thought she'd lost them and another when a shrapnel hit sent sparks down her console. On the ground, the SEAL signal came through ragged and then clear. They were pinned, one of them down, extraction delayed. Maddie's decision split the mission into before and after. Protocol said safely disengage, report, recompose. The man on the ground would die if she followed protocol. She picked between map lines and human life in a manner that felt more like fate than choice. She would press the envelope, stay in the pocket longer, burn fuel, draw fire, and give Briggs' men the seconds they needed. She radioed for an emergency suppression run, her voice steady, the rest of the squadron answering without hesitation. They pushed back the enemy long enough for the team to get clear. The operative was loaded aboard a craft that hummed and vanished into the clouds. Maddie's jet returned to the carrier heavily marked, scrape on the fuselage, one sensor array smoked, but still hers. When she rolled to a stop on the deck and climbed out, everyone looked different, admiration threaded with the raw fear that had sat in their throats for an hour. Halstead didn't smile. He didn't need to. He just fixed her with that same assessor's look, the man who measured actions and not words. "You broke protocol," he said once they were alone, voice quieter than the deck. Maddie felt the words like an aftershock. "Yes, sir. You could have lost the aircraft. I could have lost a man, sir." The room that followed would be bureaucratic, full of questions and typed reports. But in the thin private space between the two of them, Halstead nodded once and the single, small motion said more than any commendation. He trusted her judgment. Outside, the carrier sighed like a machine that had been tested and kept running. Inside Maddie, something else shifted too. The line she'd learned to walk had been crossed, she'd chosen people over protocol, and that choice would ripple in ways neither of them could map yet. That choice rippled faster than she expected, folding into paperwork, into the thin polite fury of officers who measure risk in memos. The debriefs were clinical, timestamps, vectors, weapon logs, but beneath the sterile language the questions were blunt. Why did you drop below the corridor? Why extend the window? Who authorized the suppression run? Maddie answered with the same clarity she used in the cockpit: facts, chain of events, decisions tied to lives on the ground. It helped the narrative, but it didn't mute the aftershocks. Someone on the operations floor whispered, "You saved them," and someone else scribbled, "liability." The two could live in the same chapter at the same time. Marcus watched those pages like a hawk. He respected skill, but he resented what he called reckless heroics. Where she'd seen a risk worth taking, he saw precedent that could put every pilot at the carrier in political crosshairs. The friction between them was quiet at first, sharp comments in briefings, a tense silence in the ready room, but it widened into something colder when a formal inquiry arrived from higher command. Protocol violations could not be ignored, the message said, and NATO observers would be monitoring. The carrier, once a place of simple cause and effect, had become a chessboard where moves had diplomatic consequences. Halstead walked a thin line between protecting his pilots and answering the sea of questions from admirals ashore. He kept his counsel tight, but Maddie saw the strain when he lingered in the hallway, hands clasped, eyes on some distant ledger only he could read. "You need to be ready," he told her once, voice soft for a man who normally spoke like a bell. "They'll pry. You be clear, honest, and steady." It was the same advice she'd always had, but now it felt heavier, as if every answer might tilt something critical. Back on the deck, life refused to pause. Denise and the crew doubled checks and worked repairs on the Hornet's nicked fuselage. The aircraft came back to them marked but airworthy, and the mechanics treated the plane like an old friend who'd just come back from a fight. Denise's hands moved with a rhythm that calmed Maddie, bolts, readings, the quiet certainty that metal had its own honesty. "You pushed it," Denise said, not a question. Maddie nodded. "For them." Denise grunted, the kind of sound that held both approval and worry. Fixes were done, but the sensor array would need replacement in port, and that meant a window, supply chains, waiting that tasted like threat. Meanwhile, the political undercurrent shifted their orders. Franklin Pierce was rerouted for a limited NATO engagement in the Adriatic Shield with missions under stricter oversight. That moved the drama from carrier to coalition, foreign commanders, translated briefings, and cameras that had a way of turning tactical choices into headlines. On arrival at Vitoria, Maddie felt the gaze of pilots who'd never flown with an American Reaper 1 reputation, their looks mixed curiosity and caution. Multinational exercises brought different doctrines and different tolerances for improvisation. What was a necessary deviation in one navy could be an unforgivable breach in another. Training sorties took on a sharper edge. Communications required precise callouts to avoid mistakes born of language or procedure. Marcus's skepticism devoured small errors, and his cool critiques became louder under pressure. He pushed formations hard, testing the limits of trust between wingmen. Maddie kept answering with focus, but inside the cockpit she noticed a new fatigue, less physical than mental, a quiet tally of how many times she'd chosen human lives over checkboxes. At night, briefings turned into debates. Some commanders praised her instincts, others warned that precedent mattered. The NATO liaison kept the inquiry dossier on the table like a reminder, every action now had an audience bigger than their carrier. The pressure leaked into small moments. A hangar lounge where pilots tried to joke sounded brittle. A late-night run turned into a conversation with Briggs about the cost of command, how decisions make or break trust. "You were right," he said simply. The words steadied her, but they did not erase the hum of worry. In private, Maddie wrestled with that thin line between control and silence, wondering if her calm could be misread as indifference or arrogance. Then the first real test came, an escort mission over contested waterways where rules of engagement were opaque and the political fallout of mistakes immediate. Orders were clear: observe, report, deter, but intelligence hinted at hostile drones and civilian traffic tangled in the same corridor. The flight brief ended with a reminder to follow command chains strictly. Maddie tucked the warning into the back of her mind like ballast and prepared anyway. Between the echo of the inquiry and the weight of her choices, she felt the story bending towards something larger, one that would force her to decide whether quiet competence would be enough against the storm of politics, pride, and the edge of war. That decision pressed on her like a weight, and the moment to choose arrived faster than anyone expected. The Adriatic corridor lit up with a scramble, multiple unidentified fast movers, civilian traffic nearby, and a naval convoy that suddenly reported incoming small craft behaving aggressively. Rules of engagement were tight, political eyes watching every ping, and command channels choked with officers who spoke in conditional verbs. Maddie climbed into her jet with that familiar, private calm, but underneath it a current of urgency ran so strong it felt like static in her teeth. Marcus slid into formation beside her, eyes locked, jaw set. Denise's checklist came through crisp and sure. Briggs' nod in the ready room felt like gravity. Halstead's one-line order, protect the convoy, prioritize civilians, hung like a banner over everything. They launched into a sky that tried to behave and failed. Radar painted unpredictable blips, and a swarm of small drones appeared where there should have been none. Maddie's HUD flagged them as potential threats, but the signature profile was odd, fast, erratic, low thermal return. She called out vectors and held formation tight. The first engagement was almost elegiac in its suddenness. One of the drones dipped toward a merchant vessel, and a burst of flame erupted on deck. The captain's voice came through the net, brittle and shocked. "We're hit. Fire on board. People, the rest cut off." Protocol demanded an escalation ladder, warn, shadow, disengage if unsure. But the flames licked and sailors' shouts turned into a sequence of screams that refused boxes and chains of command. Maddie didn't ask permission, she acted. She threaded a low pass to draw hostile drones' attention, using her jet as a presence, a threat vector. Marcus fell in behind and opened a suppression run, releasing non-lethal ordnance to disable sensors and motors without creating a debris field that would kill more people. The first wave of drones spiraled, some falling into the sea, others ejecting smoke like bad dreams. For a moment, it looked like they'd bought time. Then the airspace darkened with a different problem, a missile locked onto Marcus. Maddie's radio filled with alarms. Marcus broke off and dove, his jet taking a flak hit that chewed the trailing edge. She watched his wing tremble, the seam of metal buckling like a wounded animal. Marcus' voice was a ragged line, "I'm hit. I'm losing hydraulics." Protocol said to RTB when damaged. But Briggs' team on the convoy were still under threat. Extraction had started but was messy, boats swarming and small craft drawing gunfire. Maddie weighed options in the span of a heartbeat and made the same choice she always had, people before paperwork. She pushed her jet deeper into hostile territory, making herself the magnet. A long-range battery tracked, and sensors painted a cone of death closing in. Her comms lit with orders from NATO command to disengage and return. She ignored them. Her call was short, "I'll draw, cover Briggs' men." The squadron split, some followed her lead, others stayed to shepherd the convoy. Missiles screamed, she danced between rock faces and cloud shadows, flares painting the night like bleeding stars. One missile tracked too close. Maddie pitched the jet into a canyon, flared into ground effect, and used terrain masking to force the missile to detonate harmlessly against cliff rock. The G's pressed her into the seat so hard she tasted metal. Instruments pinged alarms, the cockpit smelled faintly of ozone and burnt circuitry. On the deck, Halstead watched the telemetry and looked like a man whose life had become a ledger of risks. He didn't radio her to pull back, instead he murmured something to himself and let the carrier do its job. The squadron that had once looked askance at Maddie's calm now mirrored it, trusting that her choices held more than bravado. Denise's hands worked beneath the console, sending updates and fuel calls, the whole ship moving like a living machine around a single point of focus. The turning point came when a radar signature resolved into a manned fast attack craft bristling with weapons and guided launchers, an escalation beyond drones. The craft locked onto the convoy's largest support ship and opened fire. Impressively, Maddie coordinated a precision strike with limited ordnance left, guiding a missile that disabled the craft's propulsion without detonating its magazine. The effect was immediate and surgical, the boat drifted, weapons cold, crew stunned. Briggs' team seized the moment and finished the extraction. But the mission was not without cost. Marcus made it back to the carrier, but scorched and shaken, his respect for Maddie had become something raw and human in the aftermath. The carrier logged damage assessments and crew patched wounds in metal and skin. The political fallout would come, there would be inquiries, press, the cold math of rules and precedent. Yet in the wet, diesel-stung chow line that night, men and women who had been strangers to her a week ago clapped Maddie on the shoulder, not with mockery but with gratitude complicated by fear. Halstead found her later on the flight deck when the lights were low and the world felt like a machine that had chewed through an impossible load and kept going. He didn't say the words she expected, no reprimand, no formal praise. Instead he extended a short, solid sentence. "You chose to keep people breathing. That's a ledger worth more than policy right now." It was not a clearance from the world above them, only from a man who had measured character for decades. Inside Maddie, the victory tasted like ash. She had pulled men from danger, but she'd also stretched the line between obedience and necessity until it frayed. The climb back into the jet the next morning would be measured not only by routine but by whether she could live with the quiet that follows decisions that change people's lives. The sky had demanded everything and given back a complex ledger of consequence, some applause, some paperwork, and a quiet knowing that the next time the horizon hissed with danger, she would have to choose again, and for the first few days after the engagement the world around her tightened into a slow spell of consequence, debriefs, internal reviews, and the soft, persistent hum of politics that always follows high-stakes decisions. The carrier's corridors felt smaller, like a ship folding inward to examine its own seams. Halstead held his tongue in public, but privately he walked her through what would come, formal inquiries, possible commendations, and the kind of questions that don't ask for answers so much as testimony. "Tell the truth," he said simply. "Make it precise. Let the facts carry you." She honored that counsel because it was what she trusted: metal, instruments, facts, so she answered every question with the same calm clarity that had guided her through the flight deck and the canyon runs. Outside the briefings, the crew did something practical. They fixed. Denise and her team replaced sensor arrays, patched wiring, and buffed out scorches. They treated the jet like a patient and made it whole again. Those repairs were small acts of faith, and every bolt tightened was a quiet vote of confidence from the crew. Marcus was part of that repair of morale too. He came to the hangar not to spar but to hand over paperwork, to apologize in a way that had nothing to do with words. He showed up, he listened, and when he spoke it was sober and direct. The wedge between them narrowed as the days went on, replaced by a professional respect that had real edges. It was not easy, but it was honest. Publicly the mission became a cold line item in reports and a headline that tried to do justice to both heroism and recklessness. NATO issued a careful statement praising the skill involved while promising a full review. Washington asked for updates. The media circled with the predictable hunger for drama. Maddie learned quickly how to keep her answers simple and human in the small windows where cameras asked for soundbites. She never sought praise, and when awards were discussed she deferred to the team, Briggs and his SEALs, the deck crews, Marcus, Denise, because she had always believed the credit was communal. Internally, something else shifted. Doctrine conversations, previously academic, took on urgency. Commanders debated margins for judgment, rules for escalation, and the importance of pilot discretion when lives hung in the balance. Maddie offered her perspective not as a defiant rider on policy but as a practitioner who had learned what it felt like to have seconds decide life or death. Her input mattered because she had been there. In working groups, she found a new kind of voice, less the quiet pilot and more the operative who could translate gut calls into teachable procedure. That translation moved the needle. Procedures were adjusted, training scenarios updated, and the carrier hosted workshops where pilots from allied nations flew simulated dilemmas to test both the rulebook and the human margin. Back on deck, life resumed a rhythm that was both ordinary and fragile. Flights continued, briefings scheduled, and the carrier readied for the next leg of deployment. The people who had cheered one day and questioned the next settled into a practical, necessary routine. Maddie resumed her sorties with a measured intensity, each mission a practice in judgment as much as skill. She kept lines open with Briggs, who trusted her beyond words now, and with Marcus, who had turned competitive fire into steady wings. Denise kept her tools close and her counsel closer, the two of them sharing a quiet shorthand that made the hectic deck feel tolerable. Recognition came, but it arrived quietly. A letter from Joint Command thanked the Franklin Pierce for decisive action that saved lives. A small, classified commendation slid into her file, no press release, no parade, just the official ink that mattered in the bureaucratic world. Halstead gave her a look one evening on the flight deck after a long day of sorties. It was the kind of look that wrapped approval, concern, and responsibility into one. "You did what needed doing," he said. "Now keep teaching them how to do it too." She nodded, feeling an odd relief. The ledger of consequence had been balanced not by a single shout of praise but by the steady work of correction and learning. In the quiet spaces between missions she started writing again, notes on judgment calls, checklists that tried to capture the ephemeral decisions she'd made in real time. The habit grounded her. Her notes became a resource that others asked to read, and over time they were folded into training modules used at Fort McAllister and in NATO briefings. That practical legacy mattered more to her than any medal. It meant fewer lives would be gambled on instinct alone. By the time the carrier set course for home, the immediate storm had eased into a low, steady wind. The politics would churn elsewhere, committees would convene and diplomats would parse the margins of engagement. But on the ship itself a quieter resolution had taken hold, trust rebuilt by action, doctrine adjusted by experience, and a squadron that had learned to accept that the line between protocol and necessity is not a straight one. Maddie stood on the deck one evening, watching the horizon burn a thin strip of gold, and understood that resolution isn't the end of conflict so much as its redefinition. She had chosen, and the choice had reshaped the rules. Now the work was to make those rules wiser, so the next time someone had to stand in the breach, they would have clearer guidance and sharper training, and maybe, just maybe, a better chance to come home. Maddie carried that responsibility home like a map in her pocket, folded small, worn at the creases, always there when she needed direction. The Franklin Pier steamed east, and the deck settled into a rhythm that felt like healing, the same pre-flight calls, the same clatter of tools, the same steady breath before catapult. For Maddie, the change was quieter than any medal ceremony. It showed up in a younger pilot's knock on her bunk door asking for tips on judgment calls, in Marcus leaving a binding note in her flight journal, 2 words, good wings, and in Denise handing her an extra coffee without a word but with an expression that said, you earned this. The world's louder debates continued on screens ashore, but aboard the ship the conversation was practical and immediate, how to train better, how to teach instinct without making it a loophole, how to keep people alive without ignoring the rules that keep everyone accountable. She found herself asked to speak at a training workshop back at Fort McAllister. At first she hesitated. Public speaking had never been the point, but the request came from pilots who had watched her fly and from commanders who wanted to build the lessons into doctrine. So she agreed. In the classroom she did not perform heroics or rehash press lines. Instead she talked about small things, the smell of burnt circuitry that tells you a panel has taken a hit, the rhythm of fuel checks when every second counts, the moment when you decide to cross a line and how to write that decision down so others could learn from it. She taught scenarios that grafted judgment onto checklists, and she listened as much as she spoke. Her notes, the ones she had been writing between missions, found a wider audience. Pilots who had once traded bravado for risk now took notebooks and asked practical questions. That felt like a new kind of mission. Homecoming was low-key. Families visited in waves. Halstead walked the deck once more in a way that suggested closure rather than command, and Briggs found his way to Maddie's side with a grin that still didn't do justice to what the man had learned about leadership. Marcus, quieter now, flew escort on her final training sortie before shore leave and flew it not as a rival but as a steady wing. They landed and the carrier hummed, the ship's routine moved like tides and people kept doing what they did best. The official commendation she received was not flashy, a classified note and a private handshake from an admiral, but the real return was more personal, a letter from Briggs' team thanking her for getting them home, a note from a sailor who'd been on the convoy saying he'd never forgotten the sight of her jet drawing fire away from their ship. Time softened the edge of that mission, but it didn't erase what came from it. Policy meetings continued, some argued for stricter chains of command, others for more discretionary training. Maddie didn't sit in on every argument, but she did lend her voice to the ones that mattered, training that built resilience, simulations that forced pilots to choose under pressure, and a framework for documenting split-second choices so they could be reviewed fairly. The change was incremental and imperfect, but it had weight. Doctrine bent toward the human margin without losing sight of accountability. On an evening months later, she found herself on the carrier's observation platform, the sky a quiet sheet of stars, and Briggs joined her with 2 coffees. They didn't talk about missions or medals, they talked about small things, the best diner in Cedar Ridge, a pilot's odd superstition, the way a sunset looks different from 30,000 feet. There was comfort in ordinary conversation after so much intensity. You taught us how to choose, Briggs said eventually, low enough that it might as well have been between friends. You taught us how to carry the weight. Maddie smiled without making it heroic. Teaching felt like the next step in a life that had moved from proving to building. She kept flying, because there is no replacement for practice. But she also began mentoring, sitting through simulation runs and pausing to ask the hard questions. Why did you decide that? What did you fear in that moment? How will you explain the choice to the person who will read your report? The trainees she worked with learned to speak their instincts out loud so that judgment could be tested, corrected, and refined. Marcus became one of her most reliable wingmen and, over time, a close friend whose competitiveness softened into honest counsel. Denise stayed at the deck with her toolkit and her straight look. She and Maddie developed a shorthand built out of trust. The sea kept its indifferent pace. Conflicts flared and faded in far-off places. The world made room for new stories as easily as it swallowed old headlines. But something durable remained, a squadron that trusted a pilot who chose people over paperwork, a carrier that had learned to balance doctrine with human judgment, and a small set of procedures and training modules that would shape future pilots' decisions. Maddie's quiet had become a model, the idea that calm is not passivity but a practiced force, that the best leaders make room for learning and admit when they are changed by what they do. Years later, when she stood at a classroom again and watched a young pilot answer a scenario with clarity and asking for guidance where needed, she felt an ease that had nothing to do with fame or medals. The ledger she had feared, filled with decisions and consequences, had become a teaching tool. Her choice had created ripples that bent policy, saved lives, and taught others to stand steadier in the breach. She thought of Cedar Ridge and the mountains, small from a distance but steadier than they looked, and smiled. The sky still asked for everything, but now more pilots would know how to give it what it required, and maybe, just maybe, come home.